to give you, I welcome you, and I'll give you the opportunity to describe your background and then go into your presentation.
Sure, sounds good. Thanks for the invitation. And sorry I can't be there in person. I teach a seminar immediately after this, so today was not a day I could come in person. I'm a professor of environmental health sciences at the College of Public Health at the University of Arizona, and I'm an ecotoxicologist. And I also run the University of Arizona's One Health Research Initiative, which is a state-funded initiative to tackle problems where they can be addressed through looking at human health, animal health, and environmental health simultaneously. So that's a bit about my background. And I think I can, if you could enable screen sharing, I can share my presentation. Okay, great. So
You do it.
yeah, it's working. Let me just make sure you can see it okay. Is that coming through?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to talk a little bit today about ecotoxicology of manganese, and if there's a lot of discussion or questions, like we could maybe arrange another time given that I teach right after this. But if at any point you need clarification, please let me know. So this is just a reminder that I run the One Health Research Initiative at the University of Arizona, which includes many of the large colleges at the university, in addition to my role as a professor. And I want to kind of share two things with you today. One is a little bit of work we've done down in Yuma County on toxic metals and metalloids, including manganese. This work has been supported by the Flynn Foundation, 3 different grants, with in partnership with the hospitals in Yuma County and with Campesinos Sin Fronteras, and also with the Cocopah tribe down on the border. And just briefly to show you a little bit of that, this is showing the distribution of participants we've had in our study. So we sampled 323 Yuma residents, and each resident provided a hair sample for the quantification of toxic metals and metalloids, a urine sample for perchlorate, a blood sample for hormones, and then we had health records. And all I'm going to show you today from this study is, so someone's trying to enter the waiting room, but I don't think I should be the one who's doing that, but I can see it on my screen. You guys can probably take care of that. So what I want to show you today is just a little bit of data comparing the levels of toxic metals in our animal model for this study, which is the cactus mouse, with levels in human hair, to show that animals can be a good model for human exposure. So here, for example, are data for lead, comparing rodent samples with human samples for Yuma County. They're quite similar distribution. These are levels in mercury in hair between the rodents and people. Again, very similar distribution. Here it is for cadmium. These metals so far, mercury, lead, cadmium, these are toxic in all circumstances. They have no biological function, as opposed to metals like copper and manganese, which are essential metals we have to have. It's leads to problems with building enzymes and other issues if you don't have sufficient amounts of copper and manganese. But when the levels are too high, then they can become toxic. So you can think about elements such as copper and manganese as essential, necessary elements, but too much becomes a problem. And so these are showing that copper levels in rodents and humans are quite similar in Yuma County, and here are the data for manganese between the mice and humans in Yuma County. Again, very similar. But what I want to focus on for the rest of today is just showing you an example of a manganese ecotoxicology study, this one coming from Groote Island off the north coast of Australia. This is an Aboriginal land. The Anandiliaqua people live there. So we work there at the invitation of the tribe and with funds from the tribe and from Australia's equivalent of the National Science Foundation. And what is the problem there? This is one of the world's largest manganese mines. It's on the western side of Groote Island. And the community of Ngurungu is right in the middle of the mine. When Australia did a national survey of the performance of elementary school children, they found that the kids in Ngurungu were doing about the worst of any kids in the country. So there was concern that this might be due to high exposure to manganese. And our group worked on the wildlife side of this, not the human side. But I'll show you some of the results of that. So here's the Ngurungu community. Like all complex projects such as this one, it's a complex project involving many different scientists. So we had Robbie Wilson as the lead biologist at the University of Queensland, wildlife biologist, and worked with our PhD student, Ami. And then I was supervising ecotoxicology along with one of my PhD students, Elise. We had John Postaway from the University of Oregon doing gene expression work, and Lauren Buck from Northern Arizona University on the endocrinology side. And this is just showing the proximity of the open pit mining for manganese to the Ngurungu community. And then the ore is stored at the port for export. So, and this is just an aerial image of the port showing there's also a community of people living right next to this storage area at the port. So this mine started in the early 1960s, and I'm not sure if this video, yeah, here we go. What you can see here is a manganese ore being transported from the open pit mining to the port back in the 1960s. And throughout this process, you have the liberation of fine particles of manganese dust, which is really what we were studying, because that's going to be the major exposure pathway for both wildlife and people, is through the dust. Today, they are running 49-meter long trucks along this route. They're still uncovered trucks, so there's still a lot of liberation of fine manganese particles from the mine site through transportation corridor to the storage at the port. And the concern there, again, is about children's cognitive development. But there's also concern about wildlife. This is an area of high biodiversity, and a lot of species that have been extirpated from the mainland of Australia are still abundant on the island, such as the northern quoll that you see here. The northern quoll is an endangered carnivorous marsupial, and they've been wiped out from most of Australia because of the invasive cane toad. If they eat the cane toad, they get the bufotoxin, but that kills them. But there are no cane toads on Groote Island, and they're still abundant on the island. So we mostly worked with the northern quoll, both because they're an endangered species of wildlife that's important to the biodiversity, and because they're exposed in a similar way to people are, and they live in the same communities around people. So this is our PhD student, Ami, deploying a air sampling device at one of the homes in the community there. And the first question we asked is whether levels of manganese in the air near the mine and at the port are higher than they are elsewhere on the island. And what you see on the right side of this figure are 3 different particle sizes. So 2.5 micron particles on the bottom, 10 microns in the middle, and then 100 microns at the top. And in all 3 cases, that the concentrations at the port and at the village that's within the mine are substantially higher than they are away from the mine in the central side of the island. So yes, levels of manganese in the air near the mine and transportation are much higher than they are away from the mine. And then we asked, do coals bioaccumulate manganese based on location relative to the mine? And the answer here again is yes. So if you look in Ngurungu down here where we collected coals, they had 850 milligrams per kilogram manganese in their hair, as opposed to the central part of the island, well away from the mine, where it was about 16 milligrams per kilogram. So much higher levels. And then over where the manganese ore is stored by the port, again, it's elevated in the coals. And this is based on 142 coals that we collected in 2014. So we also asked, what is the relationship between concentration of manganese and health of the coals? And we've looked at this in a variety of different ways. So one preliminary way was just looking at the average manganese concentration in the hair, which you can see on the x-axis is the log average, against the ratio of neutrophils to lymphocytes on the y-axis. And that's just a marker of inflammation. So from these data, it appeared that the coals with more manganese in the hair have more inflammation. And so we decided to follow this up with a more detailed study. And one of the things we looked at is whether manganese disrupts hormone function in the quolls. And the early evidence suggested that it might. So here you have concentration of manganese on the x-axis and concentration of cortisol on the y. So the manganese is measured in their hair and the cortisol in a blood sample. This is all non-lethal sampling. And with higher concentrations of manganese, they appear to have lower concentration of cortisol, the stress hormone. This is actually a very common finding in ecotoxicology, that animals that are exposed to high levels of contaminants often are unable to mount a normal stress response. So they end up having lower levels of cortisol in their blood. But the story is actually more complicated than that. There appears to be some difference during the breeding season, but not outside of the breeding season. And these differences are therefore not a strong effect across the lifetime of the quoll. Another assay that we did was looking at the relationship between metal accumulation in the hair and the ability of the blood to kill bacteria. So this is an assay called bacterial killing capacity, where you see how effective the blood from the animal is at killing bacteria in a petri dish. And so on the x-axis here, we have an overall measure of concentration of toxic metals in the hair, not just manganese, but all of the metals. And on the y-axis, the ability to kill bacteria in the blood. And the higher the concentration of toxic metals in the hair, the lower the ability of that animal's blood to kill bacteria. So there appears, and this is a significant effect, so there appears to be an impact on immune function in quolls. And this is showing the seasonal differences, but the main effect is that there is an impact on immune function. We also looked at something called relative telomere length, which is a measure of aging in the chromosomes, and related that to concentration of manganese and overall metals in the hair. And there the story is not clear at all, because there's differences between males and females in telomere length. So I won't really go over that today, but just to summarize these findings so far, on the x-axis here, you can see on the right-hand side the concentration of manganese in the hair. And on the left side, you can see PC1, that's all of the metals together, the main axis of variation in total metals concentration. And so the main effect that we can discuss so far is that the total concentration of metals in the hair, if you look in panel D, the higher the metals, the lower the bacterial killing capacity, that there's an impact on immune function. But the other measures don't really seem to have an effect. So no effect on cortisol when you combine all the seasons together. And relative telomere length getting different effects in males versus females, which makes it an unclear story. So just to summarize so far, then we have an effect on immune function in the quolls based on the total content of metals in the hair. So manganese appears to affect immune function, and we wanted to know if it's related to critical performance traits. And for this, we did a series of behavioral assays that our PhD student Ami led. The first was looking at sprint speed. So basically, we put out traps in the evening, collect the animals at dawn, bring them into the field lab, and we collect a hair sample to measure the metals, a blood sample for the work in endocrinology and immunology, and a DNA sample. We tag all the animals and then put them through a series of these behavioral tests. So this first one is using a high-speed camera to measure the sprint speed of the quoll from one line to another. The second test is their acceleration from a fixed point. The third test is their bite force. So they want to bite onto this instrument and not let go, and we can measure how strong their bite is. The fourth one is their grasping strength. So as you pull on them and they're trying to hold onto the wire, when do they let go? We can measure that strength. The next one is their jumping power. So they're running up a slippery vertical wall, and what's their ability to do that, which is really pretty remarkable. Their next one is their ability to run up a slippery beam, and the cameras will measure all of their errors, all of their feet slippage running up this beam. And then this one is their speed rounding a corner, and whether they make a mistake. So if they make a mistake, they crash into the paper barrier at the corner. And so we're able to measure their speed on both successful and unsuccessful attempts. And then we related all of these measures to the concentration of manganese in their hair. The only one of these that was related to manganese was the one that we're seeing now. So the animals that had higher manganese concentrations in their hair had to negotiate the corner at a slower speed or they would wipe out into the paper. And this, of course, would be related to their ability to capture prey and to evade predators. We also looked at their oxygen consumption. And so then another question we asked is, how does manganese affect the expression of genes involved in locomotion, cognition, immune function, and so on? And the way that we did this is because they're an endangered animal, you can't euthanize them for studies like this normally, but the northern quoll is the largest semmelparous mammal in the world. Semmelparous means like a salmon, where they grow up to breeding age, they put everything into breeding, and then they die. And so the male quoll is semmelparous. He lives for a year. When he gets to be a year old, he puts absolutely everything into breeding, mates with as many females as possible. And then once the breeding season is over, there's a 2 or 3 week period during which that male is still alive, but he's starting to fall apart and die. The females will live for 2 or 3 years. So we waited until every female was impregnated by inspecting their pockets, and then we euthanized some males from next to the mine and some males away from the mine. And these were males that were in that couple of week period before they die. And because of their values, we had 8 males from next to the mine and 10 males from away from the mine. Because of the value of these samples, we took them apart into 65 different samples per animal, lots of different assays done from each animal to do look at where in the animal is the manganese accumulating, how's gene expression affected, does it affect the development of any of the tissues, and so on. And the gene expression work is still underway. It's kind of a mess right now, so I don't have any gene expression results to show you, but we've been working on the histology of looking at the tissue development. This is work I'm doing with my PhD student Elise, shown here in Alaska. And we've done this work with both the northern quoll and another marsupial, the northern brown bandicoot. And we've done a series of things, including measuring the elemental composition of their teeth using scanning electron microscopy, but also looking at their tissues using histology, as you can see in those images. And the main finding from the histology is that the concentration of manganese in the hair is impacting or related to the quadricep muscle nuclei. So basically, there's a relationship between how much manganese there is and the structure of the cells in the quadricep muscles, which might be related to the effect that we found in their ability to corner a turn at speed. So what's next for Groote Island? There's a group working on whether children with higher manganese body burden have poorer cognition and motor performance, because manganese is a neuro manganese and other metals in the group like lead and cadmium and mercury at high concentrations cause irreversible damage to the brain, and so they can impact intelligence and impulsivity and those kinds of things. And they also impact motor performance, just like we saw with the quolls. They do that in people. So the people who have the highest exposure to manganese are in occupational settings, like welders who are exposed to a lot of vapor from manganese, and they can develop a disease called manganism, which looks a lot like Parkinson's disease. So there's a group now looking at the kids there to see whether there's a relationship between their manganese exposure and cognition and motor function. And then we're also asking how the trophic ecology of an animal, or where it sits in that food web, determines its bioaccumulation of manganese. So I'll just mention a couple things briefly, and then we can use the rest of our time for any questions and discussion. We've done some studies now looking at different techniques of measuring manganese in hair. This is using a technique called laser ablation, ICP-MS, or inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, and looking at the manganese accumulation that's metabolically deposited inside the hair versus on the surface of the hair. We've looked at the northern quoll, as we've discussed. We wanted to look at some other species like the sugar glider and some native rodents, but the only two species we've examined so far are the northern quoll and the northern brown bandicoot. This is a bandicoot we're releasing from a trap right after doing the sampling. And so, yeah, we'd love to turn it over for questions. I wanted to not take too long on the presentation side so that I can address any questions or comments anybody has.
Go ahead.
I have a question. I'm trying to bring your presentation into perspective of what kind of impact this would have based on your research in Australia here to our area in Patagonia, and what kind of an impact that magnesium could possibly have adversely to the students which are in a close proximity to where the mine is.
Yeah, those are really good questions. So one little thing is that people often confuse magnesium and manganese. So those are two different elements, and magnesium. So we're talking about manganese, and so manganese exposure can happen through a couple of different means, and the route of exposure is important to answer your question. So we get exposed to manganese through our food and through our water. But because manganese is an essential metal that we have to have, our digestive system is actually quite good at pulling out the amount that we need. And so we don't tend to get too much excess manganese from water or food. I'll put a caveat there because there is some effect. So for example, there was a study done in Canada that compared the upper quintile, or the upper 20% of drinking water concentrations in I think it was in Quebec, to the bottom 20%, and then looked at the IQ of the children who are drinking water from those two different sources. And there was something like a 4 or 5 point IQ spread between these naturally occurring levels of manganese in the drinking water. So there is some effect from drinking water, but the bigger effect that occurs around places like mines is through the dust, the fine particles of dust. And this dust, we get exposed to this dust both through breathing it in. The 2.5 micron dust particles permeate the alveoli of the lungs and are therefore are in circulation throughout the body. But also we breathe it through our nose, and it can pass up the olfactory nerve directly into the brain, and the brain accumulates manganese. So to answer your question on what effect it might have on kids or on wildlife, it would depend. It depends mostly on the levels of the fine manganese dust that would result from the mine. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if the dust control measures that are being proposed are what they, that's an empirical question about how much dust there would be. I don't know the answer to that. But that would be the critical question in my mind. And that's what we see on Groote Island, is that the effects on the wildlife are very much related to the levels of the fine dust that's near the mine. They don't have any controls on dust liberated during transportation in this area in Australia.
Putting aside the empirical data, what do you suggest or recommend to just a low-level John Doe like myself? How do I prepare myself when all of these studies come up? How do I prepare myself to make sure that the people that are going to be impacted, I ask the right questions?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So in my mind, the most important thing to be addressing would be what would be the levels of dust, of manganese dust produced at this mine, and both at the mine site and then during whatever transportation and processing is occurring of the ore. And I know nothing about this mine, so I don't know what they're planning, but that would be the first thing I would want to know is about the dust and how are they going to control the dust? How are they going to monitor the levels? There are good techniques to monitor them, and ideally you would want some kind of independent monitoring so that there's full transparency, that the data are really what you can rely on. And you would want some help understanding those results. So the dust would be the main thing that if I live next to a site like this, I would want a lot of information on that and have some ability to do something if the dust levels were getting high enough to cause a problem.
You say a third party to monitor how they're containing the dust. In your experience, who selects the third party?
That's a good question. So for examples like this where it's a mining site, the mine might be required to do it, but the problem there is just that they're not unbiased. It's not that they would necessarily I mean, they might do a great job monitoring it, but they're not unbiased. So just by getting someone who's independent, then you have an unbiased measure. So in the example of our project in Australia, we got funding from the Australian Research Council, which is an Australian federal source of funding to do the monitoring. And so that was independent because the federal government of Australia was paying for the monitoring, and there's no influence of the mine on that monitoring and how it's done, and the open. You want all the data to be open and available to everyone so you know what's going on. So when I teach a graduate toxicology class here, and I do work with communities all over the world on pollution problems, and there's a risk. There's kind of two big risks you have to think about in these kinds of projects. One risk is that if you say there's no problem when there is, then people and wildlife are exposed to something that's toxic. Another problem is if you say there is a problem when there's not, then you're scaring people unnecessarily and probably spending money, resources, time on something that's not necessary. So you want to avoid both saying there's a problem when there isn't and saying that there's not a problem when there is. And I think that's best done if there's some kind of independence between the testing and the people making the money from the site.
Is there an agency in the United States that you would suggest that did the monitoring in Australia that we could look at here in the States to help us?
Yeah, there are a lot of possibilities for the monitoring, and I think it comes down to the various groups, community groups there having being able to get funding in order to do the monitoring. So which comes down to being able to pay for and use the devices that the groups use to measure these things in air, and then to do the analyses. I would suggest as one possibility, you could use the University of Arizona's core analytical chemistry laboratory for the measurements. Not once the samples are collected, they could do the measurements at the core lab. It's the University of Arizona, so it's a state-funded operation. That's a good possibility. There are others as well. You still somehow have to find the resources to be able to buy the devices, deploy them, and pay for the sampling. So it might be something we need to have a bigger discussion on at another time, where I might be able to give you some advice. But there are a lot of different possible ways to do the monitoring.
Well, Catherine, I think that the monitoring aspect of it and that party element is very important to add the transparency and the credibility to what the magnesium coming out of that mine and its impacts on the population. And I think that's something that we need to bring back doctor, the professor, to give us more advice on. Because I just don't see at this point of us using mine money. I think that there'll be too much of a dark lens in interpreting that data for that. So we need some help with that, and how we can get an actual third party and have the professor, to me, give another presentation of what we can look for as an actual credible, independent third party to monitor and establish the data. Thank you.
I think there are community grants that you can get to pay for this. So I know the University of Arizona under Professor Paloma Beamer recently received a large EPA grant to help communities with these kinds of issues. And so they have staff here that are paid by EPA that can help you to figure out what kind of a monitoring program you should do and how to do it. And that's independent. It's funded by the federal government.
Thank you.
Timing is everything. I had, did I hear you say that the trucks that are hauling the manganese on the island, that they're still uncovered today?
That's right.
And so I would say, whoever's paying you, I can't remember the name of the council that you said that was paying for the study. Why aren't they saying something to the mine to cover the thing? I mean, obviously there's proof that it affects animals and people.
Yeah, so in this case, the tribe that lives there is benefiting financially from the mine. So they get a lot of royalties from the mine, and it's up to the community how they want to handle the information and what to do about it. And so it remains to be seen what the community there will decide, but they now know that there's impacts on the wildlife, and they're currently studying impacts. Another group is currently studying impacts on the children. And I think based on that, they would perhaps change the way they're doing some of the practices, but it's not illegal what the mine is doing. It's under Australian law, they're allowed to transport the ore that way. And so so you get into the also the question of if they have a permit and this is legal, then how do you get them to do things in a more protective fashion?
We have two of our panel members online, Memo or Jerry. Do you have questions? You do, unmute.
And I'll jump in while they're unmuting.
Okay.
I had a question. If your research has established whatever is the correct word, or what would be an acceptable level of manganese in the dust, and you know that's the ceiling. Anything beyond that is going to create all of the negative results you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a lot of research from all over the world on basically looking at the question you're asking, and so there's been work done in Mexico looking at impacts on children's development around manganese mines. There's of course our project in Australia. There's work that's been done in other parts of the world, and there are advisories for the amounts of manganese that are acceptable. And it's really important to remember that at low concentrations, manganese is not toxic. It's an essential metal. So it's not like lead or mercury where you have to be concerned about any level that you're seeing. It's not like that. But it's also important to remember that mines typically don't just have one metal. And so that's why we also measure other metals in projects like this. So we looked at, I think, 22 different metals in our project in Australia, because a lot of these metals co-occur with each other. Where you find manganese, you're also going to find some of the other elements like lead and so on. As you're thinking about monitoring program for air. You can also do human biomonitoring quite easily with these metals. They bind to protein in the hair, and so you can collect hair samples and measure the concentrations of these metals in the hair to understand what people are getting exposed to chronically. So, which is nice because it's an easy, non-invasive method. So, you know, as you're thinking about what you want to do, I'm happy to give you some advice, and I would really recommend working through this EPA-funded center here at the University of Arizona to help you get funding to do what you want to do. But yes, there are guidelines out there for these things.
Manganese, and my understanding is that neither EPA nor the state has that number. I mean, that's come up because of the air quality permit process right now. The manganese doesn't exist at EPA, so yes, I want to know that EPA center at U of A.
Yeah, so there's two things you're bringing up here that are really important. One is that EPA has enforceable guidelines for some kinds of pollutants, and they don't for most kinds of pollutants. Just as an example, we do a lot of work on perchlorate, which is a contaminant of water, and all across the United States. And there's no federal limit for how much perchlorate can be in water, but 22 states in the US have state standards. And so sometimes Arizona doesn't, by the way, but sometimes there's state standards without a federal standard. With something like perchlorate, we know that it's toxic at part per billion levels, and yet there's no federal standard. So just because something is toxic doesn't mean that there's going to be a standard for it. There's a lot of politics that goes into whether something gets into enforceable standards or just advisory levels or nothing. So with manganese, the suggestions at this point are based on what's been found in research studies rather than any kind of enforceable standard, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, and thank you.
Memo, do you have a comment or question? Just want to check in with you.
No, thank you. If I have a question, I'll raise my hand.
Got it. Thank you. Panel, any other questions?
I'll ask a question.
Oh, go ahead, Fritz, yeah.
So if we're gonna do a study on wildlife, do you have an idea of what that wildlife might be in the area?
Yeah, so usually with studies like this, the way that we do it is we choose an animal model that, if it's for human health, we choose an animal model that's exposed in the same way that people are exposed in the same place. And so the work that we've done in Yuma County suggests that Peromyscus mice are actually a really good model for exposure to metals like manganese, that the levels in the mice hair are very similar to the levels in human hair, and they're getting exposed in the same ways in the same places. If it were a study focused on a particular sensitive species of wildlife, then it would be about getting hair samples and other kinds of samples from that, like we did with the northern quolls in Australia. But for human health, I'm happy to talk to you about this again further when we have more time, but I think the Peromyscus mice might be a good model.
About the topography of the site, because the island has a certain topography that's significantly different than Patagonia Mountains. And of course, air, the dust distribution is affected by topography. Is that taken into account?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when we did our study on the island, we set up these air monitoring devices in different key locations where people and wildlife could get exposed, and both near and far from the mining operations. And so a similar study where you are would need to do something similar, where you would think about what are the key areas of concern. Like it might be where children go to school or where people are living, and then you're doing the air quality testing for the manganese. So the way that those work is air is forced through the filters at a known rate, and then we digest the filter in the lab to measure the concentration of the metals in the air. So there's simpler devices that will tell you the total concentration of dust of a particular size, and those can be done without any laboratory analysis. But to understand the concentrations of particular elements like manganese, the filters have to be taken to the lab, digested, and analyzed.
How about vegetation differences? Because also obviously just ground cover as opposed to tree canopies would make a difference in the distribution by wind and air of that dust.
Yeah, you guys are asking really great questions. So for sure, and the manganese is going to be in the water, which means it's going to be in the plants because the plants are taking water up through their roots. So you'll find all of these kinds of things you're suggesting, you'll find differences in depending on location relative to the mine and the flow of water and the dynamics of air movement.
We also have preferential pathways for storms in this area and obviously somewhat influenced by topography. Is that a factor?
Yeah, any kind of prevailing wind pattern is going to be a factor in where that manganese dust ends up.
Any other questions for Dr. Van Hipple?
Is climate change gonna make any difference for the distribution of?
Well, with climate change, there's more variability in precipitation and in storms. So you end up with sometimes more severe storms, but also just greater variation from year to year in precipitation. And so that could cause impacts. It's hard to say with something like manganese what those would be. We are studying the effects of climate change in the Arctic on mobilization of persistent organic pollutants from glaciers and tundra and things like that, where they've been sequestered. But that's not the situation we have in Arizona. So I'm not really sure with something like manganese, but in the sense that if it's impacting wind-blown dust, then that would be one way that it could impact it.
You're allowed to take your Zoom meeting and pass it along to people.
I'm sorry?
No, the Zoom meeting is it, can we record it and pass it along, or is there some kind of?
Yeah, you can share this however you want. It's fine with me, and I'm happy to, if there's another time when I'm not teaching right afterwards, I could come down and talk in person. That might be more effective. But I would certainly recommend as a next step you talk to this EPA funded Environmental Justice Center here that Paloma Beamer runs.